So Mark, I wanted to come back to a part of your excellent lecture, the content of the Pentagon Papers. What was the big deal? What was it? Was it that there was new information in them, or what made them such a big deal?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And um, the short answer is there really wasn't that much in these papers that that amounted to a real bombshell, right? Um, for one thing, the study only went up to early 1968. They're not released until 1971. The war had changed so much in those 2.5 years that there was virtually nothing in the Pentagon Papers that had any really direct or meaningful implications for, the conduct of American military operations or diplomatic relationships that were sensitive and important. So I think the Nixon administration's horror about the release of the papers has more to do with the prestige of the executive branch, with their sense of the need for the president to be able to conduct foreign policy um, um, with an assurance of secrecy surrounding sensitive military matters, but also diplomatic and matters as well. So it was really those are really the issues I think
Right.
that made the Pentagon Papers so controversial.
I wonder, Mark, also what you'd say to what I often say to students, which maybe is not entirely right. It seems to me it's one of a few documents, and this relates to your final screenshot with the declining trust, where a generation of Americans who still believed when presidents and secretaries of defense said things that they were telling the truth, assumed that the truth was being told. It undermined that, right? That the documents show, just in the example you gave, that there was systematic intentional lying to the public, and it made it harder to go back to that world of the late 50s, early 60s, where we believed what politicians said. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that um, Nixon, as I just mentioned, Kissinger were worried about the impact on their ability to make foreign policy, but the really long-term way in which the Pentagon Papers have, you know, damaged or changed American political culture is to contribute to this sense that people at the highest levels of government can't really be trusted to be, will not always be honest with the American people, even about the most important issues facing, the government from day to day. So,
Right.
I would put the Pentagon paper. I would give the Pentagon Papers a pretty important place in this in this in this trend that's reflected in this chart.
Right, right. Another really interesting point you made, Mark, that I wanted to follow up on briefly is the rapidity with which this sort of the crisis unfolds. Right, it takes a long time for the documents for Ellsberg to actually get them out. Right, as you say, he first tries to get a bunch of members of Congress interested, doesn't go anywhere. But then once they're released, things move very fast. Why was that?
Um, well, I mean, I would say that the New York Times was very deliberate. The editors and reporters who worked on the material were very deliberate. So there was a sort of several week period where they were kind of working away in that suite at the Hilton in deep secrecy, trying to understand what the material was. But once the publication begins on June 13th, I absolutely agree. It's remarkable how quickly things happened. And I think that is because um, uh, it's largely because of recognition, I think, in the courts that prior restraint was a big deal. It had really never been done in all of American history down to that point. And so, the government forbidding the New York Times from publishing material on its front page of direct relevance to what was surely the biggest story in the country for the past 5 or 10 years was a really big deal. And the Supreme Court seems to have understood that it was very important to move very quickly on this issue because of the the message that might otherwise be sent about the legitimacy of what the government was doing, literally stopping the presses. I do
Right.
think that Ellsberg and his team of friends and allies were also very shrewd in keeping the pressure on and keeping things moving forward. Right after the New York Times, after the restraining order is issued against the Times, suddenly the Washington Post gets into the business of publishing, and then he takes the material to 15 other newspapers, and they start publishing. So the courts were certainly aware that it was kind of a whack-a-mole situation, where they really had to move quickly, or it was just going to become absolutely impossible to get any traction on the issue at all.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So teachers, please do put your questions in the Q&A. I think Ed has put one up here for us already. Ed asks, the Pew Research Center is a great graphic. Do they have a sample average number of people? How was the data retrieved for your final graph on trust, Mark?
That is a good question. I can find probably even while we are on this uh, doing this session, the link that will give you everything you want to know about these data. Um, so
Cool.
let me answer that question by providing a link.
Right. That's probably and that'll have more detail probably than you or I know on that. Right. So this is, um, while you're doing that, Mark, I wanted to, and we're waiting. If you have other teacher questions, please put them in. I did want to give you a chance, Mark, when you have a chance, when you can, to sort of tie the string on Ellsberg, the rest of Ellsberg's experiences, right? Because these are classified documents that he leaks, right? In the way Edward Snowden leaks documents, et cetera. And that's a federal crime, right? And many people, if Edward Snowden steps into the United States again, he'll be arrested. Even those in the executive branch or any branch that misuse classified documents are subject to prosecution. You would be subject to prosecution if you misuse classified documents, right? What happens to Ellsberg?
Yeah. So as he tells us at great length in the memoir that he published just a few years ago, he released the documents, really believing that he would go to jail, and he is of course arrested and charged with crimes that could have resulted in 115 years in a federal prison. So he was up against very significant penalties, for misusing and illegally releasing classified material. What happens though during 1973 is that gradually it becomes clear that the evidence that had been collected against him was riddled with problems. The break-in at Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office was one, ugly piece of evidence about it. How evidence against Ellsberg had been collected. It also became clear that the judge who presided over parts of Ellsberg's case had been offered the directorship of the FBI by the Nixon administration, which didn't help. And it also became clear that some evidence came from wiretaps that were really problematic as well. So I don't think any one of these problems, maybe by itself, would have been enough to derail the prosecution of Ellsberg. But what happens is that the total accumulation of problems, irregularities in the prosecution ultimately lead the judge in the middle of 1973 to declare a mistrial. And that was really the end of the story. So he was never really, the trial was never seen through to the end, and he never faced any punishment.
Though he could never work for the government again, I think, after that, right?
If not as a legal matter, surely as a, because no one would hire him. Exactly.
Right. I mean, it is. I mean, exactly, because of the concerns about how he handled documents after that, right?